Welcome to the Q Podcast.
Q is about conversation.
If we're really concerned about ending poverty, we've got to be more concerned about creating justice.
Our cultural products as Christians need to both defy and resonate with the culture.
And God's doing amazing things. His church is expanding, his church is growing.
It's not what's the purpose of my life, it's what is the purpose that's been assigned.
Stay curious, think well, advance good. This is Q.
Hi, I'm Gabe Lyons, and welcome to another edition of the Q Podcast. I'm excited for you to be with us today because you're going to meet a friend, partner of Q that's been with us for many, many years, working alongside us in trying to really advance good, but in a very different context than the United States. The person who's joining me is the president of World Vision, Richard Stearns, and Rich has been faithfully leading this organization for many, many years to try to help solve problems around the world, many problems you and I probably never would encounter or many times aren't even aware of. And so today you're going to get to hear firsthand from him about a crisis that's emerging, that's developing, that we're not hearing much about in the news headlines. In fact, very little is being talked about. Behind the scenes, though, many things are happening that really are setting up this particular crisis, a hunger crisis, in Africa that most people need to know about, but few people know about. So today we said we're going to dedicate a whole episode to helping educate people on this because we need to know. As Christians, we're called to help the least of these. We're called to help the vulnerable. As church leaders, we have opportunities to engage our people, to get involved, to take care of solving some of these problems, many times with giving money and supporting these kinds of things and the work that's happening on the ground. But in other ways, for prayer, to pray for people, to see the power of God move in these situations where droughts and famine and not having access to water or food because of war and all kinds of things that are taking place in some of these communities is just devastating. And so with Rich Stearns, part of what I love about our partnership with World Vision is they have over 40,000 employees and partners all around the world who are working on the ground to meet the needs of people in all of these communities. And it's never short term. It's always a very long-term project. And so I can always count on Rich to help us just get a complete view of what it looks like in a village, in a person's hut or home, and help us to better understand what's happening. So jump right in with me. Let's listen into my conversation with Rich Stearns. Well, Rich, it's so great to have you with us today. Thanks for taking time to educate us and our entire audience on just what's taking place right now around the world. I know many people aren't as aware of what we're about to talk about as they could be and need to be. There's not a lot of great places talking enough about this, and that's why we wanted to do this together, is because in your role with World Vision, you have such a great opportunity to see what's happening in all the hot spots around the world and then bring it back and educate so many leaders, especially in American life, to how they can be involved. And so this is just going to be a lot of information and education for all of us on something that I know is very close to home for you, and you're going to be able to help us understand it. So let's talk about this. It's a hunger crisis happening right now. Just give us a sense of where this is taking place, what's actually happening on the ground, and what your people are seeing, what you're seeing as you travel into this part of the world.
Yeah, Gabe, well, thank you. And it really is important to get information on this because this particular hunger crisis is massive, as I'll share in a minute, but it's people are widely unaware of it. A recent poll showed that 85% of Americans were just unaware that there's a hunger crisis evolving in Africa today, and yet this is being called by the United Nations possibly the worst humanitarian crisis since World War II. Let me just give you some of the dimensions of this. So in East Africa, South Sudan, Kenya, Ethiopia, Somalia, and parts of Uganda are deeply affected by this hunger crisis, and but we could also add in parts of Nigeria and also Yemen for unrelated reasons. So it's affecting many countries, most of them in Africa, and there are more than 20 million people at risk of malnutrition and starvation right now. And this will make the 1984-85 Ethiopia famine look small by comparison if the trajectory continues. David Beasley is a friend of mine. He is the new head of the World Food Program, former governor of South Carolina, good Christian friend. David Beasley, in fact, he was on the news even this week, but he's saying that 600,000 children could die in the next 3 to 4 months as a result of the hunger crisis that's unfolding right now. And a hunger crisis is what we call a slow onset emergency. It's unlike an earthquake, which is very sudden. And when an earthquake happens and it's a big one, everybody hears about it in 24 hours. And there's usually a massive response by Americans to donate, to give, to come alongside the people affected. But because famine unfolds very slowly, it's over multiple growing seasons where crops fail. Sometimes it's over multiple years where the food production is below normal. So it's very hard to get people's attention around a hunger crisis. But this one is very large, and it's being fueled by both climate issues, rains that have failed, crops that have failed, but also importantly by conflict. So there's a civil war going on in South Sudan that's creating millions of IDPs and refugees. There's conflict in Somalia, almost eternally conflict in Somalia that is interfering with the farm cycles and creating refugees and internally displaced people, IDPs. The conflict in Yemen is the famine there, or the hunger there is almost 100% conflict driven in Yemen. So you've got kind of this perfect storm of drought affecting crop production and then being accelerated by conflict, which is driving people off the land and driving refugees throughout the region. So those are the things that are conspiring to create a crisis that may affect 20 plus million people.
Wow. Well, and Rich, I know I wasn't that aware of this growing crisis until in the last few months. Your team helped me start to think about it and understand it and see it and read about it. And that's one of the challenges here is, like you said, I mean, we're so used to the 24-hour news cycle and whatever's urgent or feels like is devastating in the moment gets the news. But these slow developing things that could be prevented, can be helped, can be worked on, sometimes there's never that moment to just cover it. And that's why we've got to be talking about it. And especially American Christians and church leaders, we must be thinking about this because these are some of the most vulnerable people in the world right now. And I know, for me, I remember growing up being 7, 8, 9 years old, understanding that there was a famine in Ethiopia. And I just remember how big of a deal that was as I was a kid. It was something that I still see the images of the children walking around with no food and what it was doing to their bodies. And I think many people don't understand, but what we're talking about, as you said, this could be worse than that was. And yet nobody's talking about it because there's so many other things happening in the news. And so thank you for, again, just your work and bringing this to our attention. I'd love to hear more, though, personally, because I know you recently visited northern Kenya. So you're right there. You're seeing it on the ground. You're meeting the people. You're meeting with the leaders there, seeing the children and the women, and really right in the middle of it. And I know personally, it was a deeply emotional thing, and I know it was very effective in terms of just how it touched your heart. So would you share with our listeners some of what you shared with me, just about what you saw, what was happening when you were there?
Yeah, absolutely, Gabe. And my trip to Kenya had been planned a year earlier, and a year ago, we weren't aware of how severe this hunger crisis was going to be. So we actually changed our itinerary at the last minute to make sure I could get up to northern Kenya, where the hunger crisis was really pretty severe. So the first part of my trip was in other parts of Kenya that are not as affected by drought. And on that part of the trip, I got to see all of the really positive things happening through World Vision's work there, our child sponsorship programs, our clean water programs. I mean, I saw a clean water program that is now bringing water to 100,000 people from one project that we did a few years ago. So you see lives changed and all of the positive impact of that, and families that are healthy. But then we went up to Turkana toward the end of the trip. Turkana is a pretty difficult region of Kenya to begin with. It's up near the South Sudan border, so there's massive refugee camps there. People fleeing from South Sudan are living in these refugee camps. It's also a place where most of the indigenous people are pastoralists. What that means is that they're herders. They raise goats and sheep and animals for their livelihood, and And they wander all around looking for pasture land. They're itinerant people. They kind of pitch camp wherever they are and graze the animals, and then they move on to another place. Well, what's happened because of the drought and multiple seasons of failed rains is that the animals can't find pasture. And so the animals start to starve because they can't find pasture land, and there's not enough water. The riverbeds were bone dry. And so the animals start to die. And once the animals die, these pastoralist people are living on the knife edge of survival to begin with. It's their only livelihood. And so the people start to die. And it was almost an apocalyptic scene, Gabe. You looked at the landscape there, and it was bone dry, just nothing but dust and dirt as far as the eye could see. And it was littered with the corpses of dead animals, dead goats, dead sheep, dead camels, and just bones everywhere. It looked like something out of a nightmare that you saw. And the people that were struggling to survive now, I literally saw a mother picking up a leg bone from a donkey that had died, a carcass, and she was trying to get the marrow out of the bone of the donkey leg to feed herself, but to also feed her children. So you see mother and children sucking on the bones of donkey carcasses. I mean, it's a disturbing thing to see. And this is what we saw all over the region. And of course, we saw the telltale skin and bones children, the malnourishment. World Vision supplies a nutrition center in that region, and hundreds of women and their infants were there getting assessed for malnutrition. We're trying to provide this plumpy nut, which is like a peanut butter-like nutritious food supplement that helps infants in particular recover from malnutrition. But the center is being overwhelmed. This one center that has no doctors and 2 nurses serves a population of something like 40,000 people. So they were just overwhelmed with the need. So it was a very disturbing situation and just heartbreaking to see.
Yeah, I mean, I think as a person like you who's traveled the world, you've seen some of the most devastating places, all the way from, we've talked a lot about the refugee crisis right now and what's happening in the Middle East. I know this was particularly gripping, and your pastoral heart just like breaks. And tell me more about just kind of what's going through your mind, your heart, when you personally are experiencing some of that desperate need.
My first year at World Vision, my very first trip as the World Vision president was 1998, and I went to Rakai, Uganda, and the first field visit I'd ever made to Africa was to visit ground zero of the AIDS pandemic. And I was introduced to the idea of child-headed households. And, most Americans have never even heard the words child-headed household. But what it meant during the AIDS pandemic is a household where both the mother and father had died of AIDS, leaving behind, 3, 5, 7 children, literally to live by themselves in mud huts and to fend for themselves. And so my first visit to Uganda back in 1998 was to a child-headed household. And I haven't seen too many of those since then. But in Kenya, just a few weeks ago, I visited another child-headed household, 2 boys, Peter and Samuel, and they were pastoralist family, and their father was killed in a cattle raid. Well, the other thing that happens in a food shortage is bandits, who are also hungry, are trying to steal the animals that are still alive. So there have been cattle raids and animal raids where these bandits try to steal the animals that are alive to butcher them, sell them, eat them, and in this cattle raid, their father was killed. And so they went home back to live with their mother and to struggle with her. And then she died of hunger a few weeks later. So here were these 2 boys living alone, trying to fend for themselves without a mother or father to see them. And so, this is the kind of stuff you see when you visit areas like this. And, I like to think I'm used to seeing this kind of thing because I travel to places like this all the time. But this one really got me. I had a hard time fighting back the tears. Our founder, Bob Pierce, back in 1950, had this famous little prayer that is quoted very often. He said, "Let my heart be broken by the things that break the heart of God. And as I've walked in his footsteps now for almost 20 years, I've come to understand that in this work, your heart gets broken over and over and over again. And that Bob Pierce was probably crying out to God saying, break my heart again, because if you don't, I'm going to become calloused and I'm going to be able to ignore this human suffering, but you've got to give me a broken heart. And I think as Christians living in America, where we are so insulated typically from this kind of human suffering, it's not a bad prayer for us to pray, Lord, break my heart with the things that break your heart in the world, because we can tune these things out so easily from the news media. And, I call this a Matthew 25 moment. Jesus said, I was hungry and you gave me to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me to drink. And what Jesus was telling his followers is that his compassion for the human race and the human condition is so profound that when we feed the hungry, when we clothe the naked, when we bring water to the thirsty, he said, if you've done it to the least of these brothers, you've done it to me. He was literally identifying so closely with the poor that he was saying, when you care for the poor, you are actually caring for your Savior. And so that's my appeal to the Christian community, that you would pray that prayer, let our hearts be broken by the things that break the heart of God, because it starts with a broken heart.
Yeah.
And you move from that to response.
Yeah, and a lot of our listeners, Rich, are, in the American church. Certainly we have people all around the globe listening in on our conversation, but so many are in, well-developed places, lots of different competing needs, lots of distractions, obviously. And I think in some ways it's hard these days for some of these crises to pop up on the radar high enough to get people's attention, or there's a sense of just being tired, feeling like, man, that the challenge in front of us is so large. I'm not sure I can solve this. Maybe the government can handle it. And I think of the work you guys do with 40,000 people all over the world trying to step into all kinds of these difficult situations. And I know if you were speaking to this group of pastors, Christian leaders, people that are involved in churches, but work in every kind of field imaginable, that you would say, we don't have the option to check out. Like, this is not an option for us as Christians. In fact, most of the world does check out, and most people in the U.S. aren't thinking and talking about this. So what is it that we could practically do? I want to break this down for anybody listening that's like, okay, you've challenged me, Rich. I want to pray for a broken heart. I want God to do that. And then I want to respond somehow, and I know it's probably not getting on a plane and flying to northern Kenya, but there's probably something I can do here. And will you just help us understand how we can be a part of partnering with you guys and helping support what you're already doing in order to be a part of the solution in some way?
Sure, Gabe. And, first of all, as you said, it's been very hard for this to break through our consciousness. And right now in America, we are very self-absorbed in our own politics. Politics is dominating the news media. One of the reasons the news media is not covering this the way they should be is that they're just dominated by the political intrigue out of Washington. And most of us are wrapped up in that. We're reading that every day in wherever we get our news from. And we've actually got to force ourselves to pay attention to the other things that are happening in the world. And so I'd encourage, people listening to this, make it a point every day to try to read some things or listen to podcasts like this to learn about what's really happening in the rest of the world outside of our American bubble. What's happening inside our country is important too, but you have to kind of force yourself to not turn the page when you see an article in your local newspaper about a civil war in South Sudan, or the refugee crisis in the Middle East, or the hunger crisis in East Africa. So, as I said, 85% of Americans are not even aware that there's a hunger crisis in Africa right now. Prayer is always important. Just imagine in your mind mothers who can't feed their children. They can't even nurse their children because the mothers are so malnourished that they can't produce milk for the babies. And imagine the heartbreak of a mother who's trying to feed her children and can't. So that ought to set you off into praying for the people that are struggling with these things. But there's an old saying in Africa that goes like this: pray, but when you pray, move to your feet. In other words, pray to God and pray that God would intervene, but don't just stop at prayer. After you pray, then move to action, move to do something. do what you can do to make a difference. And organizations like World Vision, as you said, are working on a very large scale in places like this to intervene. We're a partner with the World Food Program. We're partners with the U.S. government. We've got tens of thousands of sponsored children throughout the region. So you can give to a World Vision, a Samaritan's Purse, a Compassion, who are boots on the ground, making a difference and literally saving lives. I mean, we're saving lives every day in East Africa. We estimate in the 4 primary countries of East Africa that we're reaching about 2.2 million people with programs that help, either clean water or feeding programs. We're also working on sustainable agriculture, improving livelihoods and helping them develop techniques of farming that will help reduce their famine issues and more drought-resistant crops, things like that. So respond. I mean, a gift of $25, a gift of $50 makes a difference, and it's enough food to feed a family for a month, to make a small gift like that. And right now, the humanitarian community and the Christian humanitarian community, of which World Vision would be a part, we're struggling to raise money for this because people are so unaware of it. So there's not a Christian organization out there that working in the famine areas or the hunger areas that can't use some extra cash flow to support the feeding programs, the nutrition centers, the clean water programs, the things that have to be done over there to avoid this catastrophe. In 2011, there was a similar drought, not on this scale, and the international community did not act in time, and more than 250,000 people died of hunger, and more than half of them were children. And this could easily be a scenario where 500,000 people are dead by Christmas. And it's preventable. We can avert the disaster if we respond now, and hopefully the rains will come again next year or later this year. And these famines tend to happen in cycles. These droughts happen in cycles, and we may be able to get people through this crisis so that they can, live to farm another day and raise their children.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Rich, for just leading on this, for all the work World Vision's doing constantly to try to stay in front of this and to keep us educated and communicate. I know that's part of our partnership at Q with World Vision, is we want people listening to this to be part of the team with World Vision. So they can learn more at qideas.org/World Vision, where we have a page where if you go to that page, you'll be able to see much more about ways you can specifically get involved and take action. But Rich, just thank you for your pastoral heart, but also your activist heart, that calls us to say, look, it's not enough to just read the news headlines. We got to do something. And there's no time like now to take action, because it really could save lives. So thank you. Is there anything else you'd want to share with us before we're done?
Well, I appreciate the time on this podcast. You can go to our website at worldvision.org, which will give you a variety of ways you can help. It also helps us make a long-term difference in a community. In fact, we find that in communities where we've had sponsorship projects running for a number of years, they are usually protected from these kinds of natural disasters and hunger issues, because we've invested the time in improved agriculture, better water systems, better education, and the things that can help a community become more resilient. So sponsoring a child is another great way to help over a longer period of time. So worldvision.org, and it's always great to be a partner with Q, because Gabe, you and your colleagues at Q do care about the rest of the world, and I know you're using your platform to help Christians see the world through God's eyes, and that's a really important thing for us all to do.
Yeah, well, thank you, Rich. It's great being partners, and we'll be praying for you and your team as you continue forward in the days ahead.
Thanks, brother.
As you heard Rich say, we all can do something. We all can get involved. Part of that starts with just exposure and education. The fact that you took time today to just listen to this, even though it's a topic that maybe wasn't close to your heart when we began this episode, but now as you've heard what's taking place, there's no way you can turn away and you've decided to pray for that broken heart. I just ask you to continue to learn, continue to grow in what you know about the situation, and then find a way to respond, whether it's your own family donating to help sponsor a child maybe that's in northern Kenya that needs this help and support, or whether it's talking to some of your church leaders and saying, hey, is there any part of our church budget that currently is going to international giving, but because maybe you didn't realize this famine was happening, maybe we can direct some of it towards the urgency of this moment. We know that in the coming months, this is going to continue to grow into more and more of a crisis. It is something you'll hear about on the news. And for many of you, like it was for me, you'll say the first time I really understood what was happening with this famine was on this podcast. And so you'll come back to today as a marker, as a moment that it was educational and helpful. We so hope and we pray. So take action however you can. You can go to qideas.org/worldvision and see more about how you can get involved right away on this particular crisis. And until next week, I hope you have a wonderful week.